Astropolitics. As of yet, this word is completely obscure. As I type it into this script, spell check is telling me it doesn't exist, but this certainly is not the case. In the near future, astropolitics will be everywhere. But what does it mean? Well, roughly, it is the politics of the astro, aka space politics. As technology accelerates, so too does the world. Ever since the innovations made by the infamous rocket scientist Wernher von Braun in his Nazi slave labor camp, and later in his offices at NASA, scientific progress has been growing exponentially. But human progress has been growing at a far slower pace. Technology is evolving faster than politics, and the gaps are beginning to show more and more every day. Geopolitics, with the addition of the astro, is getting progressively more complex and less equal, separating the technologically superior from the inferior. Since the launch of the first satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957, the race to domination has sped up each year. Naively, we believed for decades that space was the common domain of humankind, meant for shared progress, but now we know that isn't the case. Space is not for everyone. Space is for the strongest. The space race is something which needs no introduction. The capitalist United States versus the communist Soviet Union in an intense showdown to see who was technologically superior. This set the precedent of space's politicization, but in writing, the rest of the world tried to make it anything but. Space technology was growing rapidly, and the world watched anxiously. Within the span of just 12 years, the first man-made satellite was placed into orbit, the first man went to space, and the first man walked on the moon. It was clear that humans had made it far, and space was no longer the great unknown place it once was. Now it was within human reach, and needed to be regulated, lest humanity's flaws be taken up there. And so in 1967, the very 60s named Outer Space Treaty was signed, and is still in force today, remaining the basis of all space activity since. Placing weapons of mass destruction in orbit was banned. Countries were forbidden from claiming territory on the moon or other celestial bodies, and the moon was outlined as being for peaceful purposes only. For the time, it was sufficient. Today, it is limited and incredibly ambiguous. Weapons of mass destruction may have been banned, but weapons in general were not. Countries may not be allowed to claim territory on the moon, but private individuals and companies could do what they liked. As for the moon being for peaceful purposes only, well, there was no definition for what peaceful actually meant. Switzerland may define peaceful as without any military presence whatsoever, but that means nothing if the United States defines it as using a military presence to ensure the peace. As well as this, there was no provision regarding the extraction of resources from space, an oversight which led to the Moon Treaty in 1979. The Moon Treaty was basically the Outer Space Treaty, but with a few extra laws to cover the issue of resource extraction. It outlined that any resources gained from outer space were for the common benefit of humankind, not for the benefit of single countries or, most importantly, for the profit of private individuals and companies, finally erasing the loophole. But this didn't fly, and the treaty was a complete failure, only being signed by 11 countries and ratified merely by 5. This means that the outdated, limited and ambiguous Outer Space Treaty from 1967 still stands today. When the treaty was first signed, there were only 172 orbital satellites. Now there are approximately 6,000. With 2,666 being operational. In 2020, the United States sought to bridge this legal, scientific gap with the Artemis Accords were a huge landmark in astropolitics, but not for the reasons you'd expect. The Accords state that countries must work together on the moon regarding resource extraction and set about plans to finally return there in 2024, hopefully putting the 13th man and first woman on its surface. Crucially, the Accords also set about plans to establish cooperative moon bases for research and mining, bases which, in the near future, could be used as refueling outposts for further space travel. The Artemis Accords could have been a huge step forward for international scientific cooperation, but, like the Moon Treaty before, failed to get the signatures. However, unlike the Moon Treaty before, the signatures it did get could prove detrimental. 8 countries signed the Artemis Accords: Australia, Canada, Japan, Luxembourg, Italy, the United Kingdom, and, most importantly, the United States. You may spot 2 major countries that are noticeably absent: Russia and China. Russia has been cooperating with the US and NASA in scientific endeavors since the docking of a Soviet Soyuz with an American Apollo craft in 1975, so their absence would have been a surprise a few years ago. However, Donald Trump's formation of Space Force, the US military's branch in space, concerned the Russians, even more so when Space Force accused Russia of spying on US satellites. So Russia said no to the Accords. China's absence is less surprising since the Wolf Amendment, signed by US Congress in 2011, banned NASA from cooperating with the Chinese without FBI permission. The absence of these 2 space powers, combined with the presence of America, means that the Artemis Accords are counterintuitive to their goal of increased cooperation. It states that space research and exploration shall be for the good of humanity, but until everyone signs and ratifies it, it's only good for the 8 countries who agreed. There are no plans to end the Accords, meaning that the construction of moon bases will go ahead in the near future, something which Russia and China are nervous about. The 2 countries have warned the US that if plans are to go ahead, they will consider any activities on the moon an invasion and will respond accordingly, possibly with bases of their own. This means that, soon, we could see American, Russian, and Chinese military bases on that thing you can see in the sky every night. The Cold War space race was a matter of prestige, to prove which political system was the most advanced. The new space race is a matter of dominance, to prove which country has the strongest military. Up until the 20th century, history's motto was "He who controls the sea controls the land." After, it became "He who controls the air controls the ground." Now, it could well become "He who controls space controls the earth." But here we run into another problem. What even is space? Land is defined basically as not the sea. The sea is defined basically as not the land. Both of these things have very clear boundaries. Anyone who isn't blind can tell an island from an ocean. But what is space defined as? Not the Earth? And more importantly, where does space begin? If this question isn't concretely answered, then it could cause some major problems. Currently, distances for where space begins vary from country to country. The scientific definition, known as the KARMAN-LINE, is that space begins at 100 kilometers above sea level. But that hasn't stopped the US Air Force from putting it at 80 kilometers. This means that, theoretically, if America is to position a satellite at around 90 kilometers above sea level, and that satellite flies over China, then China could shoot down the satellite and legally claim they had the right, since it trespassed over their airspace. Forget about maritime boundaries. Astro boundaries will be the flashpoints of the future. Space itself is also not as uniform as we once thought, and above the KARMAN-LINE are more divisions. Professor Everett C. Dolman from the US Air Force's Air Command and Staff College divides space into 4 broad categories. Terra, the Earth and its immediate airspace. Earth space, the lowest possible orbiting region. Lunar space, between Earth's orbit and the Moon's. And solar space, everything beyond lunar space. Right now, Earth space is the most valuable piece of real estate. Strategically, it'll prove vital should space become more militarized. There is where we'll keep our weapons pointing down. In the near future, lunar space may become more vital as refueling stations for trips to the moon, but also to link communications with any moon bases. In the distant future, solar space will be the most valuable, as humans venture further and further from Earth's and the moon's orbit. For now, at least, things will remain a little closer to home. Colonization of the moon is not only inevitable, it could begin before this decade is out, something which, if the Artemis Accords remain unchanged, will cause some great tensions. If China and Russia's absence is not dealt with, then armed conflict, or at the very least armed tension on the moon, is a very real possibility. But it's not just countries in on the action. Private companies are showing us that they are increasingly willing to pick up the mantle. Free enterprise and capitalism, like them or not, breed innovation, and no one shows off this innovation quite like Elon Musk. His SpaceX corporation has been speeding up technological advances, most notably reusable space shuttles. But at the same time, the incentive for profit means that space travel is now at risk of commercialization. As bizarre as it sounds, we could see luxury hotels in space and on the moon if this continues. It may sound ridiculous to you now, but in many ways the corporate dimension of space exploration mirrors the early days of capitalism and imperialism from the not-so-distant past. It hasn't even been 300 years since the entirety of modern-day Pakistan, India, Bangladesh and Myanmar were ruled by one single corporation, and they weren't even the only ones. Around the same time, similar structures were in place in French Louisiana and the entirety of modern-day Indonesia. It's not out of the question that the same could happen to the moon. After the moon, almost inevitably, humans will colonize Mars. In the current state of affairs, should that happen, we could see the establishment of Earth-like borders on the Red Planet too, as countries establish colonies and compete for territory. After that, who knows? Technology is advancing at an exponential rate. It's entirely possible that we could be colonizing other celestial bodies in a shorter time frame than you'd think. As the pioneer of astronautic theory, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but humanity cannot stay in the cradle forever." The possibility that these colonies and bases will be for the shared benefit of humankind is doubtful. It is likely that countries and people simply won't be able to reconcile their differences enough for the greater good. Scientific advances will propel humanity to become an interplanetary species. However, it seems humanity is destined to bring its tribalism and division into the cosmos.